All right. Hey guys, what is up? In this lecture today, we're going to be talking about the Second Great Awakening. And if you're thinking, Miss, we already talked about that. No, 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 guys. That was the First Great Awakening. And that was about 100 years before this one that's going to take place in the 1800s. So as far as time frame wise, what we're talking about here is during its heyday from the 1820s basically to the 1840s. And remember, we're discussing the politics of Jackson, the Jacksonian era of American history. Jackson was president from 1829 until 1837. And so this corresponds with Jacksonian America. The First Great Awakening was religious revivals, primarily focused in New England. Remember Jonathan Edwards and sinners in the hands of an angry God. We are dangling upon a thread, humanity above the spindle, above hell, and it's all very emotive and everything. And that was a questioning of values. That was a revival of the Puritan faith with traveling ministers, especially Jonathan Edwards, who was the grandfather of Aaron Burr, remember, and George Whitfield, who had that orphanage in Bethesda, Georgia. So that was the First Great Awakening, and it was important. Remember that it did lead to this general questioning of authority, which takes us into the Revolutionary era when we question the authority of the King of England himself. It allows for new ideas, but mostly it made people more religious when it came to Puritanism. Um, and that was something that people have been getting away from, especially we're talking about New England and Massachusetts. This Second Great Awakening is going to be much more across the entire country. Now, the country at this time in the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s in America, keep in mind that this is the country as we know it at this time. Okay, here's New England up in the Northeast. Here's the South, the Southern, the antebellum era. Okay, this is the Old South. Okay, and then you also now have this new kind of Northwest region with Ohio and Indiana, Illinois, the Great Lakes, and all of that. Remember, Missouri was just added as a state in 1820, the Missouri Compromise. And so this is the country at this point. All of this lands to the west, including Texas, until 1845, are not part of the United States yet. Oops, go away, Alexis de Tocqueville. Je parle français. Je oui, oui. There we go. Sorry. That Frenchman wanted to take over. Okay. And I think an interesting thing to point out would be that the center of America, if you were to like average like where people were living at this time, um, at the start of our country was about over here. Okay, that like most of the people in 1790, for instance, right when George Washington was beginning and the United States was beginning of the Constitution, most of our people lived on the East Coast. That was the center of American life. Everything from here east. Okay, by about 1830, when we're talking about now, during the time period of this new Second Great Awakening, that is going to be all the way over here, which means like half the population is on the East Coast, but then another half has moved and is all over here. That is an enormous shift in migration westward. And so this Second Great Awakening isn't just going to be for one region, it's going to be across the United States and especially focused on all of these new Western peoples. There we go. Okay. And what is the Second Great Awakening? Well, like the first one, it's a series of religious revivals. So it's going to be getting people much more religious, religiosity. Um, but it's also going to be a really key ingredient in many of the reform movements that start to take shape in the early to mid 1800s that are going to change the fabric of America. We're talking women's rights, women's suffrage, feminism. We're talking about abolition and emancipation with slaves. We're talking about civil rights, equal rights. We're talking about the movement for temperance, the ending of alcohol. We're talking about a rise in public education, in better asylums for those who were mentally ill, better prison systems that were more humane. for convicts, like all sorts of things. These are what we call the reform movements, because reform means trying to make things better. They really were inspired, many of them in some ways, not like completely, but many of them were inspired by this Second Great Awakening, this move towards more religious society. So when we're talking about the Second Great Awakening in this lecture, basically organize it in your mind in two ways. We're discussing what caused, what inspired this movement towards a more religious society, Christian religious, by the way. And then the second thing that we're covering is the effects this is going to have. So, like most things in history, we're studying the causes and effects. And the effects are going to be those reform movements I was just talking about, as well as the specific new Christian religions, Protestant Christian religions that will be coming from it. Okay, so all that being said, let's dive in. Okay, how was the Second Great Awakening different from the first? I mentioned the first Great Awakening with like Jonathan Edwards centered around Puritan ideas. Puritanism, remember, is Calvinism. I know you've heard this like so many times, but it was like 100, 200 years ago that we talked about this. So remember, Calvinism is about predestination theory. The idea that before you are even born, God has determined where you're going to end up in, that your entire life has been predetermined. You are fated, in fact, for either heaven or hell. That was called under Calvinism and Puritanism, the idea of the elect versus the damned. And you really had no choice. Now, there were signs, remember, like the visible saints, and we talked about this like with the Salem witch trials and stuff, that basically there were signs to indicate which path God had chosen for you, but you could not do anything to alter his fate that he had in mind for you. And so that was Calvinism. That's Puritanism, or the Puritans in New England and Massachusetts and all that. Okay, the Second Great Awakening, we're moving entirely away from that and saying that no, let's take the reins of our lives ourselves. This predestination theory is being tossed out the window, and instead, many of the priests traveling around, the itinerant preachers, who would literally, they didn't have a church community of their own, so they would ride around and preach to the masses in big outdoor revivals. So especially out west, like in Cane Ridge, Kentucky and stuff, you could see in the picture, a minister would come to town. It would be a big hado, and everybody come out in their finest Sunday clothes, and there would be thousands of people there for like almost like a fair environment. And they'd listen to this guy talk, and women would faint, and people would be screaming, and it was like a rock concert, basically. But this new religion that these ministers are preaching on is about people taking matters into their own hands. Our fate is now our own. And the kind of life you live will help to determine where you're going to go. So you do have a say in which place you'll end up in, either, heaven or hell. And so that's a big departure from the First Great Awakening. And it does a few things. It kind of democratizes religion. It means it's for everyone. If you're not like already determined to be going to the bad place or the good place, well, then it's anybody's game. Anybody can make it. That's what I mean by democratize, for the masses, for the people. Everybody can have a choice here. And it's not just for white men either. You're going to see in the Second Great Awakening, many, many women take a center stage. Many African Americans get converted during this time to kind of Southern Christian values like the Baptist faith. Many women will actually even become leaders of their faith community. This is during the time when you have the cult of domesticity beginning, okay? So why is this happening at this time? This is getting into the causes, okay? Remember that in the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson wrote about all these Enlightenment ideas, virtues from like John Locke about natural rights. about when a government becomes destructive of these ends, it's the right of the people to alter or abolish that government and create a new government in its stead. In the Constitution, Enlightenment ideas of Montesquieu with the separation of powers and checks and balances, the three branches. So the Enlightenment was really, really heavy in the American consciousness in the 1770s and 1780s. And the Enlightenment had been an idea, remember, from the earlier 1700s. But it had also led to new ideas on religion, where you tried to reconcile religion with logic. And out of that, you got like deism. Remember deism? It's the idea that we are entirely in control of our own fate because God is just like the watchmaker. He wound up the universe and then just let it go. And he's watching from above, but he doesn't actually interfere in anything happening. Our fate is in our own hands. Unitarianism, that's a faith that John Quincy Adams believed in. That was also very similar to deism. So you had these new, very kind of scientific looks at religion, and a lot of ministers were very nervous about this new logical religions that were devoid of like the passion and the church membership and the followings that churches had previously had. So one of the reasons why the Second Great Awakening is going to happen is in reaction to that fear that people were getting less religion when it came to traditional like Christian faiths. Another reason why it's going to happen is because of the market revolution. Remember, we talked about this idea of the way people were working and living their lives changing because of the rise of industry, the rise of new methods of transportation in America. Well, this is going to have a bunch of social effects as well, including this new revival in religions, because previously most Americans were farmers, right? And they existed under a sort of barter economy. Bartering means, hey, I got these oranges, you got these apples. Instead of us paying a bunch of money to each other, why don't we just trade those apples and oranges? It's like a trade economy. But in order to have a trade economy work, you kind of have to trust that the person you're trading with is good for it. They're not going to swindle you, that they're not a con man. But most people at this, before the market revolution, that wasn't a problem because you knew who your neighbors were. The people that you did business with were the people who lived very close to you. You had intimate knowledge of who they were and what values they had. You see where I'm going with this, right? Well, now with the market revolution, with this new, modes of transportation like railroads, steamships, canals, with the beginning of the telegraph that will happen around this time. Now everything is much further apart. Now you can do business as a farmer in Missouri. You can have your stuff go on a steamship on the Mississippi River and go all the way down to New Orleans, Louisiana. And then you can sell your crops from Missouri to London, England, or to Paris, France, or anywhere else in the world. You've suddenly been opened up to a national and an international economy. But how can you trust you're doing business with good people who aren't going to take advantage of you? And so that's one of the ways that historians believe that we might have also gotten this renewal in religious vigor, the Second Great Awakening, at this time in the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, because people were anxious, people were nervous about how open and vast the world was now, and how could they trust these people that they'd never met in person, that they were doing business with, that their livelihoods depended on. Well, you could trust if they were also religious. Religion gives people kind of a sense of, a person's values. So that might have been another cause for the Second Great Awakening. Likewise, with the market revolution, we talked about industry. There's, especially in the North and New England, there's the rise of all these textile mills. And eventually we get actual factories by the second industrial revolution in the later part of the 1800s. But with mill work and with like later on, what you think of like with factory labor, you have a bunch of workers, men going off to work, punching in, when their time begins, working all day, and then going back home. Again, now you're not working from home with just your family. You don't have that cottage industry, that subsistence lifestyle anymore. Now you're working for somebody else, for wage labor. And for like bosses, how do they know they're going to have a good workforce of these factory workers who are going to be sober, which means, not getting drunk all the time? How are they going to know that their factory workers aren't going to be late and disorderly and rude? Well, religion can help with those things. Religion instills values. And I know that's kind of a bleak outlook, but we're just trying to figure out, like, why was there a rise in this religious fervor at this time? And that could be one possible explanation. Now for women at this time, why are many women going to be becoming very religious? Well, the cult of domesticity, the cult of the domestic. Women become the center of the household at this time because men are going off to work in the mills and the factories now. Um, Women are left at home to raise the children. Previously, men and women, fathers, mothers, they work side by side at the farm. But now the woman, as the center of the household, becomes the moral center of the house. She's the one instilling the values on her children. And again, religion teaches values. So the woman becomes the religious center of the household. And many women, like I said, become key leaders of this Second Great Awakening and of many of the reform movements of the 1800s we're going to talk about, such as temperance, such as abolition. And of course, as they fight for these things, women realize that their voices are not being heard by the government, by the state, or by the national government, because they don't have a say in the government. They have no vote. And that encourages women to begin to also fight for suffrage, which means the right to vote. Okay, so those are a few of the causes for the Second Great Awakening. Now we're going to kind of dive into some of the effects and what it actually entailed. It encouraged a new evangelical sort of Christianity. So the faiths that come out of this are evangelical. And when we say that word, evangelical, we're talking about a sort of Protestant Christianity that is much more about a person's individual connection with their God than with the church connection. It's also a sort of Christianity that emphasizes a kind of fundamental approach to the Bible. Like the spoken word, the words of the Bible are taken very literally. That is kind of what it means to be a fundamentalist. You go back to the fundamentals, that's the Bible. So those are two of the things we see in many of the new religions that come out of the Second Great Awakening. What they all have in common is a much more, taking the Bible in its literal terms, a fundamentalist approach, and wanting to spread the word. That's where the word evangelical comes from. And some of the new, why is that not switching? Sorry, hang on, guys. There we go. So there's what I was talking about, trans-denominational movement within Protestantism. That means there's multiple new denominations of Christianity that are going to come out of this, like the Millerites, the Mormons, the Church of Latter-day Saints. You have the Shakers, and you have many other groups that will come out of this. But that's what it means by trans-denominational. So many different new groups of Protestant Christians. Emphasizes salvation by grace through faith and personal relationship with Jesus. So you have to have that conversion experience. That's like why Baptists, that's how they get the name Baptist. You're baptized, meaning you've had that connection to God and you're born again. So the born again Christianity is also a theme you see throughout many of these new denominations that come about from the Second Great Awakening. Biblical authority, like I said, another word you might want to put in your notes for that is fundamentalism. And that does become really important throughout the 20th century, moving ahead. I'm skipping ahead a little bit, but bear with me. When we talk about religious fundamentalists today, they're a very powerful political voice in America today. This is where they come from. When we talk about like the Scopes trial and Southern conservative Christian religious values, like in the 1920s, this is where that comes from. So that is fundamentalism. It's taking the Bible on its literal terms. And then the activism, that's another theme of many of these new faiths from the Second Great Awakening. Like I said, we'll get these reform movements. We'll get the abolition, the temperance, women's rights, the asylums reforms, the public education reforms, all with kind of this emphasis of, hey, we want to be better Christians. We want to, you know, be good Christians so we'll end up in the good place. And there's also the idea of like the rapture. Many of these new faiths, they would predict the coming of the apocalypse. And it sounds weird, but they actually like wanted the apocalypse to come. You're like, they all want to die? What's going on? Well, like we think of the apocalypse as like the end times, but for them, the apocalypse would be the second coming of Jesus Christ, that he would come back to earth, basically once we created heaven on earth, and then he would reign over us in kind of a terrestrial paradise for like 1,000 years. And that's where you get like the Millerites. And then there were all these religious figures who basically they'd figured out and calculated when they predict when Jesus would come back. And then people would wait and hope. And of course, you know, these dates passed, and then they'd set a new date, and then that would pass still without Jesus coming back. But that's what all that was about. That was all part of this Second Great Awakening. In order for Jesus to come back, though, we had to make the conditions here on earth better. Okay, he wasn't just going to come back to like, you know, a terrible world. And again, that's also an influence on the reform movements. The social gospel movement later on in the progressive era, that's in the early 1900s, emphasized good Christians doing good deeds like philanthropy. Philanthropy is when you give back to those less fortunate. And so this is the time period where it literally meant, hey, if you're a good Christian, you know, prove it, be a good person, give back to those who are less fortunate than you are. That's the social gospel movement. And there's those reforms that I talked about. So you need to know what each one means. So here you go. Temperance means trying to temper the amount of alcohol you have. And eventually this will lead to the idea of prohibition much later on, which is where you want to completely get rid of alcohol in society, because alcohol was seen as a sin, an evilness that brought out, you know, the bad parts in a person. Abolition is the freeing of slaves. Feminism is the idea of equality for women, okay? The rights of those suffering from mental illness, like I said, there will be a reform towards better asylums, or actually just having asylums, because previously many people who were mentally ill or severely disabled, they would end up on the streets and dead. Having asylums, an asylum we know today, like we think of asylums, we think of this terrible, scary, haunted place. But actually back in the 1800s, just building asylums, having a place for these people to go was seen as a kindness, a mercy, a reform movement, something to make things better for them. Public education did not exist before this time period. So this, we'll see the beginning of it. Previously, you had to be super rich in order to get an education. And if you could not afford one, you would not be educated, and you had no chance of ever bettering your situation in life. That is why public education is so important. It's the great equalizer, as later President Lyndon Johnson will say. And the rights of the accused and other reforms. So this is going to be partially a result of the Second Great Awakening. Great stuff from John Green. If you ever want to get a review of what we're talking about, go on YouTube, watch his stuff. It's good. Okay. So the first of the reform movements is temperance. All right. So with temperance, you need to know about the preacher from Connecticut, Lyman Beecher. And if his name sounds familiar, that's because he has a very famous daughter named Harriet Beecher Stowe, who was the author of one of the most famous books in American history called Uncle Tom's Cabin. Uncle Tom's Cabin was a story about an African-American slave named Uncle Tom who is going to go on a journey trying to help out some other slaves and eventually, not to spoil anything in the book, some very bad things happened to him. And it was a book that really humanized slaves. Remember, for most Northerners, they didn't grow up around slavery. By this time in the mid 1800s, her book actually comes out. Uncle Tom's Cabin was published in 1852. Civil War, by the way, will break out in 1861. There's an apocryphal tale about Abraham Lincoln meeting with Harriet Beecher Stowe, and he says, supposedly, "Now you're the little lady that started this great war." That's not really Lincoln's voice, but we don't really know what Lincoln sounded like because, we don't have any record of his voice. But anyway, her book is going to humanize these African Americans for Northerners who did not grow up around slavery, who were only told about slavery from Southerners who viewed slaves as property. And there will be a Supreme Court decision called the Dred Scott case that will actually legally declare that African American slaves had no rights and were not humans. It was probably the worst decision in the court's history from the 1850s. All that being said, this book showed that they were people with feelings and with families and with loves and lives and tragedies. And it made many Northerners feel very sympathetic to the plight of slavery and will convert many to the other great reform movement, abolition. So that is Uncle Tom's Cabin. And Harriet Beecher Stowe, she's the daughter of this minister, Lyman Beecher. She was raised in that household. And so her Christian values are very evident in the book. Through Christian love, the characters are saved. Temperance in general, though, is the idea that we need to lessen our consumption of alcohol, that alcohol was a terrible, evil sin in America and it needed to be done away with. Now, at first, Lyman Beecher and others who religiously of the Second Great Awakening are preaching on temperance. At first, they're just about the bad spirits. They're really, really, very potent drinks such as whiskey and rum and vodka. They didn't really have vodka at this time yet, not in America. But those really potent spirits, they wanted people to stay away from. Later on, though, you'll get the teetotalism movement, teetotalers they were called, who actually want a total ban on alcohol, basically complete abstinence from drinking alcoholic beverages. Now, previously, like in America in the 1700s, everybody drank alcohol. Everybody drank beer or some form of fermented beverages. It wasn't that big a deal. But now with this new emphasis on religion from the Second Great Awakening, and also the proliferation of alcoholic beverages because of the market revolution, and now the transportation revolution that went along with it, now there's a lot more of it. It's becoming a much bigger problem in society. And so these religious figures are going to try to tackle that. So you get the birth of the American Temperance Society. That's the ATS. And by 1836, they have over 1,250,000 members in over 8,000 chapters across the country. And this was an international movement as well. It wasn't just in the United States that people were getting concerned about alcoholic consumption. It's also going to be in England. It's also going to be in other parts of Europe and around the world. But these people who believed in temperance, they're motivated by a variety of reasons. As far back as the American Revolution, you had the father of American medicine, Benjamin Rush, starting to point out the problems that alcohol consumption can cause in a person's health. Even diagnosing like liver failure and other severe health problems compounded by alcoholism. So the health factor is one cause of this, as well as the religious factor of the Second Great Awakening. Another cause, we talked about how women play a very important role in the Second Great Awakening. Many women were brought over to the temperance reform movement because they saw alcoholic effects on their husbands. Men would go to the tavern or to the saloon or to the bar, wherever they drank at, away from their families. They would get drunk and they would squander much of the family's money. Um, Remember, at this time, women were not really in control of their own finances. We talked about this with the Low Girls. Remember those mill girls up in New England? A woman would typically, if she worked for a living, her paycheck would go to her father if she were unmarried, or to her husband if she were married. So, not being in control of her own finances, she's helpless to do anything, as her husband spends all of the family, maybe even her hard earned money at the bar, leaving very little for herself or for her children to exist. So that was a real problem financially. And then, of course, there's also domestic abuse, which was very common. Men who were drunk would come home drunk and they would abuse their children or their spouse, their wife, or they would just be neglectful of them. That's also a form of abuse. So it's for all these reasons that the temperance movement really kicks up. And again, that's a huge number. By 1836, over 1,250,000 people. That's huge, and it's just going to grow. And by the 1850s, you're going to get an expansion of this with like the Women's Christian Temperance Union, led by Frances Willard. It'll become an international organization with hundreds of thousands of people, led by a woman. By the 1890s, you get the Anti-Saloon League out west that was promoting temperance. And of course, going further into this, again, flashing into the future, the 18th Amendment will eventually be passed that will ban alcohol in America from like 1919 until 1933. That was the era formerly called Prohibition. The 18th Amendment was prohibition, which meant prohibiting alcoholic consumption. Now, it doesn't last because you can't really enforce that, and it led a lot to the corruption, the gangsta era of the 1920s, the roaring 20s, like Al Capone and gangsters like that. But this is all an eventual reaction to this temperance movement that we're just talking about getting started here during the Second Great Awakening of like the 1820s, 1830s. The next great reform movement is abolition, and that is a huge topic. So we'll save that for our next lecture. Thank you guys so much for listening. I'll talk to you later. Bye.